He'd moved to the desert to reinvent himself.
He wanted to get out.
His past life wouldn't follow him there.
He could leave everything behind and have a fresh start.
In the process, he found love.
I'm Shanice.
He's really attracted to her.
Nice to meet you.
She had a beautiful smile.
This was the person he could start his new life with.
But he would never get the chance.
The neighbors heard multiple gunshots.
The apartment's riddled with bullet holes.
She found him in a pool of blood.
Had his past finally caught up with him?
He had been going from that life for several years at that point.
There's no getting out.
Or was passion to blame?
When I heard that, I was astonished.
This is just shocking. It's heartbreaking.
He didn't deserve to die that way.
February 10th, 2006. 29 Palms, California. It's a cool and quiet morning in this desert oasis, an hour east of Los Angeles.
It's kind of secluded. There's not a lot of people there. The biggest attraction in the town would be the Joshua Tree National Park.
The town is also home to the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center military base.
At 11 a.m., 21-year-old Shanice Bailey has just arrived at the home of her boyfriend, 28-year-old Lewis Kimball.
Lewis,
She hadn't been able to get a hold of him all morning and was starting to become concerned.
are you in there?
But outside Lewis's apartment, Shanice makes an alarming discovery.
The window was shattered.
Shanice uses her key to open the front door, but once inside, her worst fears are realized.
Oh my God, Lewis!
She found him lying on the floor in a pool of blood.
It was the most horrifying way she could have found him.
Lewis!
Lewis was completely unresponsive, so Shanice immediately called 911.
Yes, I think my boyfriend is dead. Please send somebody now.
28-year-old Lewis Kimball never had it easy.
Lewis grew up in Westmont in South Central Los Angeles. It's a poverty-stricken area.
They call it Death Alley because there's so many murders in the area.
Lewis often found himself lacking stability growing up.
He moved a lot. He was really just bouncing around. There was times that he would live with an aunt. Maybe he would live with his mother.
But Lewis ended up finding his real home on the streets.
Lewis kind of fell into the gang culture and became, very, very involved in the gang life. He dropped out of school. He was on a pretty destructive path.
He felt as though no one cared about him. He didn't see the need to go to school.
It's almost like it's a rite of passage in that area. The youth, especially the male youth, looked up to these gang members because that's their family. The way things work in LA gangs is you have to put in work. So you have to hit a lick, you have to, do certain things to prove yourself.
Lewis racked up many drug offenses just to show them that he was really down.
You want that street credibility. It's like it's just life. There's no getting out of the game. Once you're in, you're in.
But to those who knew Lewis best, like his friend Candace Hicks, there was much more to him than his tough exterior.
He liked to give off the impression that he was tough. He had this sort of like bop when he walked, but he was really funny. He was a prankster, and he was a real sweetheart.
Lewis was also known for his intelligence.
A lot of people think that men or boys who are in gangs are idiots. They're dumb. They dropped out of school because they couldn't hack it. And he was very smart. Even though he was in this gang, I knew his true potential.
When Candace decided to go away to college, Lewis was inspired to make a change in his own life.
I got into college.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my God, Candace, that's what's up. Doing it.
I went to school for pre-med, and he was really happy about that. He was proud about that. I think that watching me do it, watching me be the proverbial rose that grew from concrete, it inspired him, at least momentarily, to do something different.
Maybe one day I'll get out of here too, so.
Yes. Look, I believe in you. You've always been ambitious, so
That's
In 2003, Lewis left South Central Los Angeles and the gang life behind.
Lewis tried to turn his life around. He moved to 29 Palms.
Lewis was really looking forward to start his life over and, just start something new, something positive.
He enrolled into a continuation school in order to finish high school.
So he eventually decided to get his diploma and just really get away from the gang life.
For Lewis, the remote location was perfect because no one would ever find him there. He was hoping to leave his criminal past behind and get a new fresh start at life.
Lewis was even able to make a fresh start at love.
After moving to 29 Palms, Lewis went on a few casual dates, but none of the relationships lasted.
Until he met 21-year-old Shanice Bailey after connecting with her online.
Lewis, nice to meet you.
She was beautiful, she had a beautiful smile. He just was really attracted to her, just drawn to her personality, and he was quickly taken by her.
You want some to drink?
Yeah, sure. Martini, please.
Martini for the lady.
They just had this immediate connection.
She was charming and down to earth.
So, do you ever miss LA?
Why? Everything I need right here.
Before long, the two were inseparable.
And he thought this was the person he could start his new life with.
Instead, Shanice would be the person who found Lewis.
Lois, are you in there?
In the most horrific condition.
She is not able to contact Lewis, so she decides to, pay him a visit. To her surprise, she finds a boyfriend.
Oh my God, Louis!
In a pool of blood.
When first responders arrive, it's clear there's no hope for Lewis.
At this point, he was dead on the floor.
It's just as obvious that police have a homicide on their hands.
The cause of death was gunshot wounds.
The walls are riddled with bullet holes.
To detectives, it looks like a classic gang-related hit.
Former gang member Lewis Kimball had left his troubled life in South Central LA behind for a fresh start 140 miles away.
Lewis settled on 29 Palms, a small town in the desert.
Secluded, somewhere where he could just really start fresh.
After a few other failed relationships, Lewis had fallen in love with 21-year-old Shanice Bailey.
He saw a lot of potential in their relationship and thought that this could be a part of the puzzle to, starting a new life.
But had Lewis's old life finally caught up with him?
Oh my God, Louis!
On February 10th, Shanice found Lewis dead inside his home.
Lewis was lying on the floor in a pool of blood.
Yes, 911!
As police begin processing the scene, it's clear Lewis's death was no accident.
The window was shattered, the wall was covered in bullet holes, and Lewis had been shot in the neck.
Investigators determined that Lewis must have died almost instantly.
The shot to his neck had penetrated his carotid artery, and he bled out.
Based on the level of rigor mortis, police surmised Lewis had been dead for around 24 hours. But why had he been killed? Looking around the home, detectives rule out robbery as a motive.
Investigators didn't find anything to be out of place.
Cash, electronics, and other items of value were undisturbed.
In fact, it didn't appear that Lewis's killer had even entered the home.
There were no signs of forced entry or of a struggle taking place inside.
All the shots appeared to be fired outside the home.
Found these shell casings in the parking lot.
An officer removed multiple .380 and .40 caliber shell casings from outside the home.
The shell casings reveal an alarming fact about the crime.
Finding these shell casings on the ground would, suggest that there were actually two shooters, and they just opened fire on Lewis without even stepping foot in the home.
You think it's gang-related?
Investigators wonder if Lewis's prior gang involvement may have come back to haunt him.
They knew from a preliminary search of his records that he was involved in some gang activity before moving to 29 Palms.
To police, this looked like classic gang-related violence.
29 Palms has its own shady side.
Because it's in a desert area that's very sparsely populated, there's a lot of drug activity. There are drug labs and things like that.
Some of the drugs would wind up an hour away in Los Angeles, but a lot of them would circulate throughout the town.
Which meant 29 Palms wasn't entirely free of the same type of gangs Lewis left Los Angeles to escape.
Some of the businesses that cater to them, unfortunately, tend to produce a certain amount of property crime and other activities. If he was involved in criminal activity, there might be enemies as a result of criminal activity.
Back at the station, detectives begin looking over 911 call logs to try to determine what time the shooting took place.
From the looks of the crime scene, 7 shots had been fired on Lewis's home, so there was a good chance someone called in to report the noise.
Detectives are in luck.
San Bernardino 911 received several calls from Lewis neighborhood early that morning.
Several people had called law enforcement and reported that they'd heard multiple gunshots around 1 or 2 a.m. Deputies were dispatched, but they didn't find anything.
Investigators know those must have been the gunshots that killed Lewis Kimball, but who fired them was still a mystery.
While several neighbors had heard the shots and called 911, none of them had actually seen the shooters.
As investigators continue their search for answers, news of Lewis's death spreads.
One of my friends called me and she's like, hey, did you know Lewis passed away?
What?
And I was like, what? What happened?
You can't be serious.
And that's when I found out that he was murdered.
Not Lewis.
And when I found out that he was murdered, I was devastated. Nothing inside of me could fathom why someone would kill him, especially when he had gotten away from the gang activity. It just didn't make sense to me.
Anyone who knew Lewis knew he had been out of that life for a while. It was part of the reason why he left Los Angeles in the first place.
But could someone from Los Angeles have followed Lewis to 29 Palms? Hoping for more information that could help lead to a motive, detectives decide to sit down with the woman who discovered Lewis's body, his girlfriend, Shanice Bailey.
Shanice was completely distraught when officers first arrived at the home and was taken away while they processed the scene.
Now that she's had some time to gather her thoughts, detectives circle back to her to get her official statement.
So, how long did you know Lewis?
About a year.
Did he ever tell you about his time in LA?
I know what you're thinking.
She told investigators there was no way that Lewis's death was gang-related.
But Lewis isn't into that lifestyle anymore.
She was adamant that he had been gone from that life for years at that point.
That's what he told you.
It's true.
She knew that he was trying to make a better life for himself.
But when detectives ask Shanice if Lewis had made any enemies in 29 Palms, she has a ready answer.
According to Shanice, there was only one person who would have wanted to harm Lewis, his ex-girlfriend, Nicole Sullivan.
In 2006, Los Angeles police estimated the city's street gangs had approximately 40,000 members, and that gangs were responsible for almost 60% of Los Angeles homicides. In 95% of gang-related homicides, the victim was male. And while the median age of victims was 24, 30% of young men killed by gangs were still in their teens. February 10, 2006. In 29 Palms, California, detectives investigating Lewis Kimball's murder suspect his death is gang-related.
I know what you're thinking.
However, Lewis's girlfriend, Shanice Bailey, swears that isn't the case.
She didn't believe at all that this was gang-related. She knew that Lewis had left that life behind and he was on the straight and narrow.
Instead, she suspected that an ex-girlfriend of Lewis's had something to do with the murder.
That ex-girlfriend is 21-year-old Nicole Sullivan.
Shanice said she didn't know all that much about Nicole.
But you've met her.
Just once.
When was that?
Wednesday night.
That would have been a few hours before detectives believed the murder occurred.
Shanice says that the night started out like any other.
They decided to go to the club that night in 29 Palms.
They were having a few drinks, just hanging out.
They wanted to have a good time.
Instead, they ran into Nicole.
Shanice told detectives that Nicole actually approached them at the club.
Hey, Louis. Who is she?
That's my girl, bro. What are you talking
Who
about?
the hell are you?
That led to a confrontation between the two women.
Look, you need to stay away from my man.
Oh, it's a little too late for that.
Shanice and the ex-girlfriend had words. They start to push each other.
Get out of my face.
And it gets to the point where, a fight breaks out.
Chill. Hey, chill.
Don't play with me.
Lewis has to actually step in.
In an effort to break up the altercation, Lewis pushed Nicole off of Shanice and onto the ground.
She pushes him back and he pushes her harder. When he pushed her, she fell.
Oh, you done it now, Louis.
She got a cut to her head, and when that happened, she was really upset.
The argument had really escalated. At that point, club security had to intervene.
They were all thrown out the club.
But Shanice says that as they were being escorted out, it was clear that Nicole wasn't about to let things go.
You're gonna pay for this, Louis. You're gonna pay for this, Louis.
She's yelling that, I'm gonna have somebody get you.
Bye, Nicole.
A few hours later, Lewis was dead.
So you think this Nicole killed him?
Yeah.
But you weren't there.
No.
She doesn't go home with him, and he ends up going home alone.
Shanice says she tried calling Lewis in the morning, but he never answered.
It wasn't a big deal at first, but when I couldn't get him on the phone this morning, I started thinking about what Nicole said.
She was worried about what may have happened, so she came over to the house.
She finds him dead on the floor in a pool of his blood.
Oh my God,
After wrapping up their conversation with Shanice, detectives make speaking to Nicole Sullivan their top priority.
She's a possible person of interest that detectives need to look into.
Based on Shanice's story, it sounded as though Nicole had actually threatened Lewis just hours before he'd been shot.
Was she upset enough to kill Lewis in cold-blooded murder?
When detectives sit down with Nicole, she seems distraught over the news of Lewis's death.
I can't believe it. I just saw him
When was that?
Wednesday night at the club. He was with this girl.
Nicole admitted that she had been in a fight with Shanice at the club, but she also said she didn't start the fight.
That girl, Shanice, she attacked me.
Why would she do that?
Nicole told police that she and Lewis were actually in the process of getting back together.
But he was with Shanice then.
Yeah, so,
But didn't that make you mad?
a little.
She said she was only upset because he was in public with another woman.
She denied having anything to do with Lewis's murder.
Detectives are now wondering if Shanice had a motive for murder that night.
She didn't know me and Lewis planned on getting back together.
Until the run-in at the club.
Look, you need to stay away from my man.
Oh, it's a little too late for that.
What's she talking about? What's she talking about, Louis?
At this point in the investigation, detectives don't know who to believe.
Lewis Kimball was quite the ladies' man. He had two women fighting over him.
But did one of the women go so far as to kill him?
Did you go to Lewis's apartment that night?
No.
Unsure who to believe, detectives pay a visit to the club where Nicole and Shanice had their showdown.
Investigators want to get a more objective viewpoint of what happened the night Lewis died.
The staff at the club corroborated that Shanice and Nicole were fighting over Lewis.
Yeah, they seem to be fighting over a guy, causing a ruckus, so I escorted him out.
The bouncer said after he kicked them out, Nicole left with the people that she'd been hanging out with that night.
However, the bouncer also adds a surprising new detail.
As the group was being kicked out of the club, Shanice and Lewis got into a fight.
Get out of here. Come on, let's go.
I'm not your baby.
Shanice!
To detectives, this explains why Lewis went home alone that night. But does it also point to his killer?
Investigators became immediately suspicious because Shanice had left that out of her story.
In February 2006, detectives in 29 Palms, California now suspect it was a tangled love affair, not gang violence, that led to Lewis Kimball's murder.
The night he died, there had been a fight at the club involving his current girlfriend, Shanice Bailey, and his ex-girlfriend, Nicole Sullivan.
What's she talking about, Lewis?
I don't know what she's talking about.
Oh! That girl Shanice, she attacked me.
Why would she do that?
I know what you're thinking.
Both women are trying to shift the blame.
All right, man. Thank you very much. That's all we need, okay?
Police investigating the murder caught themselves in the middle of a love triangle, with everyone pointing the finger.
According to bouncers at the club, Shanice had even gotten into an argument with Lewis after they broke up the fight with Nicole.
Shanice had left that out of her story.
I'm not your baby.
Shanice!
Shanice and Nicole each seemed to have a motive to harm Lewis.
Maybe the women had teamed up. If Lewis was two-timing both of them, there were two different types of shell casings found at the scene.
It's 380 and 40 caliber.
Which indicated there were two different shooters.
However, detectives still don't have solid proof that either one of the shooters is Shanice or Nicole.
There was no forensic evidence at the scene that would link to either woman, or anyone else for that matter.
There were no prints on the shell casings found at the scene.
No one had actually seen the shooters.
Looking for new leads, detectives make an appeal in the local news media, asking the public for information.
As a result, they hear from a local man who's actually a taxi driver in the area.
He happened to be near Lewis's apartment building the night of the shooting.
The cab driver says he didn't witness the murder, but he believes he did see the shooters.
He had been driving along his way to pick up a customer when he heard several loud bangs.
He claimed he saw two men running from the apartment complex after hearing shots fired.
This new revelation throws investigators for a loop.
If there were two men involved, then that would immediately eliminate Shanice and Nicole as the shooters.
But it does confirm for detectives that there were, in fact, two shooters.
Who those shooters are remains a mystery.
Unfortunately, the taxi driver can't give detectives any identifying details about who the shooters are.
The cab driver's story didn't entirely exonerate Nicole and Shanice either.
Even if the women didn't pull the trigger, it doesn't mean that one of them wasn't the mastermind behind the whole thing.
What you want to do?
Detectives decide to switch gears and contact the friends who had been at the club with Nicole on the night of the altercation. Perhaps they knew more about what happened afterwards.
Those were people that the detectives would definitely want to speak to.
Have a seat right here, please.
Detectives learned that Nicole had been out with Sister Sierra and Shayla Walker, so they bring them in for an interview.
Sierra and Shayla were adamant that they did nothing wrong.
We barely even know Lewis, okay?
But they also revealed that Nicole had lied to detectives.
Did you go home after you got kicked out of the club?
Well, no.
They had not gone straight home after they left the club, like she said.
After being thrown out of the club, they ran into a couple of friends in the parking lot.
Hey y'all, what's going on?
Those friends are 24-year-old Antoine Williams and 19-year-old Bryson Hall.
This place sucks tonight. Y'all wanna go somewhere else?
Yeah, we can go back to my place.
That's cool. Y'all wanna do that?
According to Sierra and Shayla, Bryson drove the group over to his house to hang out after they had run into each other.
At Bryson's, Shayla and Sierra saw Nicole discussing something with the two men.
They didn't know what was being discussed until Nicole said it was time to go over to Lewis's place.
Hey, y'all, we're gonna go over to Lewis's place. I kind of want to have a word with him after what happened earlier.
Sierra and Shayla felt a little uneasy about going over there after the altercation in the club, but they wanted to support their friend.
So you all went over there?
Yes.
The Walker sisters have just put Nicole at the scene of the crime.
The girls insist that Nicole only wanted to talk to Lewis.
They said, honestly, she loved Lewis. She just didn't want him to be mad at her.
Once the group arrived at the complex, Sierra and Shayla say they waited in the car, while Nicole and the guys approached Lewis's apartment.
We'll be right back.
They did think it was odd that Antoine and Bryson were going in with Nicole, but they sort of brushed the red flag aside.
According to the sisters, chaos soon erupted.
The sisters said they heard several gunshots and saw Nicole running back towards the car.
Nothing. We gotta get out.
Seconds later, Antoine and Bryson followed suit, and the group sped off into the night.
Sierra and Shayla said they were dropped off at home after that, and they didn't ask any more questions.
They were afraid about what could happen to them if they asked anything else about what had taken place.
Still, the sister story fits with what detectives already know.
There were 2 different caliber of shell casings at the scene.
The taxi driver saw 2 males fleeing the scene.
But if the Walker sisters' account is true, Nicole could have been one of the shooters.
The sisters remember Bryson, Antoine, and Nicole approaching the home before shots were fired.
That means any combination of the 3 could have been responsible for firing the shots that killed Lewis.
You're free to go.
Detectives knew they needed to get these 3 into custody ASAP to get to the bottom of what happened that night.
In 29 Palms, California, detectives investigating the homicide case of 28-year-old Lewis Kimball have just learned that one of their suspects, Lewis's ex-girlfriend, Nicole Sullivan, wasn't entirely truthful during their initial interview with her.
Nicole's friends Sierra and Shayla Walker said they had gone with her to Lewis's place the night of the shooting with Antoine Williams and Bryson Hall.
We'll be right back.
Sierra and Shayla recall shots being fired, but they didn't actually see who fired the shots.
Police immediately put out an APB for Antoine Williams and Bryson Hall. In the meantime, they bring Nicole back in for another round of questioning.
What is this about? I already told y'all everything I know.
She continues to deny having any involvement in Lewis's death.
I didn't have anything to do with what happened to Lewis.
But when detectives confront Nicole with what the Walker sisters told them, she begins to break down.
When she realized that she had been caught in a lie, her demeanor completely changed.
I didn't mean for this to happen.
Nicole admits that the group went over to Lewis's place that night and echoes the Walker sisters' claim that she'd only intended to talk to her ex.
We'll be right back.
But according to Nicole, Antoine and Bryson had other plans.
She said the men rushed ahead of her towards the apartment, and everything happened fast after that.
As she followed them, the men just opened fire on the home.
Nicole said that as soon as the men started firing, she took off back toward the car.
It was all Antoine and Bryson. I had nothing to do with it.
She said after hearing about what happened at the club, the guys must have taken it upon themselves to punish Lewis.
She maintains that, her intentions were only to talk things out with Lewis. She had no ill will as far as violence towards him.
But under California law, all three individuals could be held responsible for this tragedy.
When detectives finished interviewing Nicole, they put her under arrest for the murder of Lewis Kimball.
Stand up, please, ma'am.
I had nothing to do with his murder. It was Antoine and Bryson. It wasn't
Hands
me.
behind your back, please.
The theory was that she was an aider and abetter of that crime.
I only wanted to talk to him.
Detectives aren't convinced that her intentions are as pure as she's leading on.
This way, please.
In the eyes of law enforcement, there was no reason for Antoine and Bryson to kill Lewis unless Nicole put them up to it.
The next morning, police are able to bring Bryson Hall into custody. But he isn't much help in unraveling the mystery of who really orchestrated this crime.
He didn't want to talk to detectives about what happened that night and lawyered up.
He also didn't give information on the whereabouts of Williams.
And tracking down Antoine will be easier said than done.
Days go by, and police are starting to think, maybe somebody tipped them off.
They're not sure that they're going to be able to bring him to justice because he's on the run.
But on February 18th, detectives receive a promising tip.
Homicide.
A woman called in and said she was currently in Vegas with Antoine.
She had seen on the news that he was a wanted man and knew she had to say something.
She agrees to tell police, where they can find him.
Once the tipster gives them Antoine's location, detectives arrange for Las Vegas police and federal marshals to take him into custody.
9 days after the murder of Lewis Kimball, police arrest him.
But just like his pal Bryson Hall, Antoine isn't willing to say much.
He also lawyered up right away.
On May 15th, 2007, the murder trial against Nicole Sullivan, Bryson Hall, and Antoine Williams begins inside a San Bernardino courtroom.
All three defendants were tried together.
But the outcome will shock even the most seasoned attorneys.
She recants a whole story.
You could have knocked me over with a feather duster when I heard that.
What I'd like everybody to know about Lewis was that he had a really, really big heart. And I think maybe there just wasn't enough people to bring that out of him, which is why a lot of people didn't see that side. So I just want everybody to know, don't count someone out because they've had a horrible past or a criminal past. Because at the end of the day, there's still someone inside. And that someone is often a really, really good person.
On May 15th, 2007, the joint trial against Nicole Sullivan, Bryson Hall, and Antoine Williams for the murder of 28-year-old Lewis Kimball has gotten underway. Unfortunately, none of Lewis's loved ones are able to be there.
No one showed up on Lewis's behalf, like no family or, anything like that. I attempted to attend the trial, but I wasn't able to go because I had to work. 29 Palms is 2 hours away from Los Angeles. It's a long way to drive for a lot of people.
In their opening statement, prosecutors assert Nicole Sullivan's jealousy and rage against Lewis Kimball fueled Bryson and Antoine's actions.
The prosecution theorized that Bryson and Antoine were the ones who fired the shots, but that they did it at Nicole's behest.
There was much testimony about the dispute that boiled over at the nightclub immediately before the shooting took place.
Hey, Lewis. Who is she?
The prosecution argued that when Nicole saw Lewis in the club with Shanice, she just became enraged.
She was mortified and embarrassed.
Oh, you done it now, Lewis.
She felt like, she had been assaulted.
You gonna pay for this, Lewis? You gonna pay for this?
According to the prosecution, as soon as Nicole ran into Bryson and Antoine outside the club, she began plotting her revenge.
Prosecution maintains that they knew exactly what they were going to do when they headed to Lewis's apartment. Why else would they go to the house at 2 o'clock in the morning, armed?
Prosecutors weren't sure which man fired the .40 caliber and which fired the .380.
One of the bullet strikes that struck Mr. Kimball severed one of his carotid arteries, which would have had him bleed to death within minutes.
And by the time of the trial, 2 other witnesses have come forward who claim that Bryson Hall has talked about the crime.
His girlfriend and his aunt told the courtroom that Bryson had been bragging about shooting up Lewis's place.
But will jurors hear from the other person who identified Bryson and Antoine as the shooters? Nicole Sullivan.
She was interviewed by the police prior to my representation of her, and she gave a rather detailed statement to them, which basically placed the blame for the crime on the 2 male individuals.
It was all Antoine and Bryson. I had nothing to do with it.
However, the fact that Nicole was being tried with Bryson and Antoine complicated things.
The tape was inadmissible in court because at the time, she was the co-defendant.
As long as she was a co-defendant, it's simply inadmissible hearsay.
Which puts the prosecutor in a bit of a bind.
He needed the statement from her to identify the 2 shooters. He couldn't get it while she was a co-defendant with them. And that's when he came to me.
The prosecution needs Nicole to agree to take the stand and testify against the 2 men. So in the middle of the murder trial, they decide to offer her a deal.
She'd be allowed to plead guilty to felony assault with a firearm.
In exchange for her testimony, she only had to serve 3 years probation.
She would be released that day, provided she testified.
With the risk of life in prison hanging over her head, Nicole takes the deal.
Okay, I'll do it.
There was really no practical choice in the matter. My client was charged with murder, and that was just too big a gamble to take.
But are the prosecutors taking an even bigger gamble on Nicole? When their new star witness takes the stand, nothing goes as they intended.
She takes a stand, she shocks everyone.
She recants a whole story identifying Bryson and Antoine as the shooters.
She claimed she had no memory of making any such statement.
The prosecutor is just disgusted by her actions. He described her demeanor on the stand as just despicable.
However, Nicole's sudden reversal doesn't completely derail the case.
At that point, under the rules of evidence, the prior statement that she made became admissible in evidence. So that gave the prosecution the opportunity to play that recorded statement in the case against the 2 remaining defendants, and that's what they did.
They basically impeached her with her prior inconsistent statement.
But will that be enough to secure Bryson and Antoine's convictions?
Attorneys for Bryson and Antoine argued there was no proof they were the shooters. They claimed it could have just as easily been Nicole Sullivan.
On June 11, 2007, after 3 long days of deliberation, the jury returns with a verdict.
The jury found both Bryson Hall and Antoine Williams not guilty of first-degree murder.
You could have knocked me over with a feather duster when I heard that. I was astonished that they were acquitted.
According to the jury, due to the lack of evidence and the conflicting witness account, there just wasn't enough for them to convict.
The only person who ends up behind bars is Nicole Sullivan.
Recanting her story on the stand broke the terms of her plea deal.
Since she violated the plea agreement, the prosecutors rescinded the offer of parole.
Although Nicole isn't found guilty of murder, she is found guilty of felony assault with a firearm.
Accounting for time served, she spends less than 2 years in prison.
For Lewis Kimball's loved ones, the outcome of the court proceedings just makes his death an even harder pill to swallow.
The fact that no one was convicted of murder itself made it feel like Lewis would never get justice for what happened to him.
for anyone to go shooting into someone else's house. Anyone who does that should absolutely be behind bars, because you have given us reason to believe that you don't value human life. He didn't deserve to die that way.
Lewis Kimball was a young man who tried admirably to turn his life around, only to have it stolen from him.
It was just really sad that Lewis was on the right track, and after struggle, just was never able to get to the top of that mountain. And for it to end like this, it's just heartbreaking.
Once the verdict came down, what came to mind was something that he said as a young kid, which was, "I'm gonna die by the time I'm 21." In a later conversation, and he was older than 21, he said he didn't think he was gonna live to see 30. And he died just before he turned 29. So that resonated with my heart.
It resonated so much that Candace did something to ensure that while he may be gone, Lewis Kimball will never be forgotten.
I said, you know what? I'm gonna take his last name. And in August of 2007, I changed my name to Candace Kimball, so that he knows that somebody did care, because I would carry it for the rest of my life.
Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The first clue was hidden in a place no one thought to look. For more than 30 years, a single unanswered question haunted a quiet town surrounded by empty roads, fading memories, and a secret that refused to disappear. What happened on that cold autumn night? Who was responsible? And why did the truth remain buried for so long? For decades, the case sat untouched in a forgotten corner of law enforcement files. A name written in black ink. A photograph slowly fading with time. Evidence locked away while the people who loved the victim waited for an answer that seemed impossible to find. Then one day, everything changed. A new discovery forced investigators to reopen the case. A piece of evidence that had been overlooked for years suddenly became the key to a mystery that had survived generations. And when the truth finally emerged, it shocked everyone who thought they knew what happened. The story began in a small community where everyone knew everyone. A place where neighbors waved from their front porches, where children rode bicycles through quiet streets, and where people believed terrible things only happened somewhere else. But on one night in 1993, that sense of safety disappeared. The victim was 28-year-old Emily Carter, a young woman remembered by friends and family as someone who could light up any room she entered. She was known for her kindness, her determination, and the way she always made time for the people around her. Emily had plans for the future. She had a career she was building, friendships she valued, and a family who believed they knew exactly where her life was heading. But on a rainy October evening, Emily vanished. The last confirmed sighting came shortly after 9 p.m. She had left work and was expected to return home within minutes. It was a route she had taken hundreds of times before. Familiar streets, familiar turns, a journey that should have been routine. But Emily never arrived. At first, those closest to her believed something simple had happened. Maybe her car had broken down. Maybe she stopped somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe she needed help. But as the hours passed, fear replaced confusion. Her family contacted authorities. Friends began searching the areas she was known to visit. Volunteers walked through fields, checked abandoned buildings, and searched roadsides, hoping to find any sign that would explain her disappearance. Instead, they found only silence. Emily's vehicle was discovered 2 days later on a remote road several miles outside town. The discovery immediately changed everything. The car was not where anyone expected it to be. There were no clear answers waiting inside. No obvious explanation. No message. No person coming forward with information. Only questions. Investigators examined every detail. The position of the vehicle. Items left behind. Possible fingerprints. Possible witnesses. Every small piece of information became a potential doorway to the truth. But every doorway seemed to close. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded. Detectives interviewed friends, co-workers, acquaintances, and anyone who might have crossed paths with Emily before she disappeared. Rumors spread. Theories developed. Some believed Emily had left voluntarily. Others believed someone close to her knew more than they admitted. Some questioned whether a stranger had entered her life at exactly the wrong moment. But suspicion was not proof. And without evidence strong enough to identify a suspect, the investigation slowly began to lose momentum. Months turned into years. The headlines faded. The search party stopped. The phone calls from investigators became less frequent. But for Emily's family, the case never ended. Every birthday brought another painful reminder. Every holiday carried the same empty space at the table. Her parents grew older waiting for the one thing they wanted more than anything else: the truth. They did not want revenge. They did not want headlines. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what happened to the daughter they lost. They wanted the person responsible to face the consequences. For law enforcement, the case became known as a cold case, a mystery frozen in time, waiting for a breakthrough that might never come. The file remained open, but years passed without a major development. Until decades later, when technology began changing the way old cases were investigated. Advances in forensic science allowed detectives to examine evidence in ways that were impossible in the 1990s. Old materials were reviewed. Old statements were reconsidered. Old assumptions were challenged. The investigators assigned to the renewed case understood something important. Time had passed, but the truth had not disappeared. Somewhere inside the evidence was a story waiting to be uncovered. And then they found something. A detail that had been sitting unnoticed for years. A small piece of information that suddenly connected pieces of a puzzle investigators had been trying to solve for decades. The discovery reopened questions that many believed would never be answered. Who had been hiding the truth? Why had the case remained unsolved for so long? And how could one overlooked clue finally expose what happened on that terrible night in 1993? The town that had learned to live with the mystery was about to face a shocking reality. Because after 30 years of silence, the cold case was moving again. And this time, investigators were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. For 30 years, the answer had been buried beneath layers of forgotten evidence, unanswered questions, and memories that slowly faded with time. But when investigators reopened Emily Carter's case, they were not searching for a story from the past. They were searching for the truth. The renewed investigation began quietly. There were no dramatic announcements, no press conferences, no promises that a breakthrough was coming. Investigators knew better. Cold cases were fragile. Every decision mattered. Every assumption had to be questioned. Every piece of evidence had to be examined as if it had been discovered for the first time. Because sometimes the smallest detail could change everything. The detectives assigned to Emily's disappearance started by reviewing the original case files from 1993. Hundreds of pages. Interview transcripts. Evidence reports. Photographs. Handwritten notes from investigators who had long since retired. Inside those files was a timeline of confusion, frustration, and uncertainty. But there was also something else. A pattern. The original investigation had focused heavily on the people closest to Emily. Friends. Co-workers. People who knew her routines. That was standard procedure. When someone disappears, investigators often begin with the victim's personal circle because relationships can reveal motives, conflicts, and hidden information. But decades later, investigators noticed something unusual. One person who appeared in the early reports had never been fully examined. A name mentioned briefly. A person who had been interviewed once and then disappeared from the investigation. At the time, there was no obvious reason to look deeper. Now, with modern technology and a different perspective, that old interview suddenly stood out. The detectives began rebuilding Emily's final days. They spoke with people who had never been contacted before. They searched for forgotten records. They compared old information with new databases. Every conversation created another piece of the puzzle. And slowly, a different picture began to emerge. The night Emily disappeared was not random. Someone knew her routine. Someone knew where she would be. Someone understood the roads she traveled and the places she trusted. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. The question was no longer only, what happened to Emily? The question became, who knew enough to make it happen? As investigators dug deeper, they discovered a strange detail connected to Emily's abandoned vehicle. Something inside the car had never received the attention it deserved. A small item collected during the original investigation had remained in storage for decades. At the time, forensic technology had limits. Testing methods were not advanced enough to reveal what investigators can discover today. But now, that evidence was carefully removed from storage and examined again. The process was slow, precise. Every sample was handled with extreme care. Investigators knew the importance of what they were doing. This was not just another piece of evidence. This was a possible connection between the past and the present. For Emily's family, the reopening of the case brought emotions they had not felt in years. Hope, fear, and uncertainty. After 3 decades of disappointment, they had learned not to expect miracles. They had watched other cold cases receive answers while theirs remained frozen. They had seen headlines about breakthroughs in other communities and wondered why their own family never received that same moment. But now, for the first time in years, investigators were telling them something different. They believed there were still answers waiting to be found. And that was enough to reopen old wounds. Because solving a cold case is not only about discovering what happened. It is about forcing families to return to the moment their lives changed forever. Emily's parents remembered every detail. The last conversation. The last smile. The last ordinary day before everything became impossible. For them, Emily was never just a missing person in a file. She was a daughter, a friend, a person whose life mattered. While investigators worked behind the scenes, the community began talking about the case again. People who had not mentioned Emily's name in years started sharing memories. Old conversations resurfaced. New tips arrived. Some were useless. Some were impossible to verify. But investigators followed every lead. Because after 30 years, even a small piece of information could become the missing link. Then came the moment that changed the entire investigation. The forensic results returned. And what investigators discovered forced them to take a second look at everything they thought they knew. The evidence pointed toward a person connected to Emily's disappearance. Someone who had been overlooked. Someone who had lived with the secret for decades. The name was not immediately released. Investigators moved carefully. They knew that a cold case could collapse if they moved too quickly. They needed more than suspicion. They needed proof. They needed a chain of evidence strong enough to survive in court. So they continued digging. They examined old records. They tracked movements. They compared statements made years apart. And with every new discovery, the mystery surrounding Emily Carter's disappearance began to shrink. The case that had once seemed impossible was becoming clear. But the closer investigators came to the truth, the more disturbing the reality became. Because if their theory was correct, it meant the person responsible had been living freely for decades. While Emily's family waited. While the community searched. While investigators wondered if they would ever solve the case. The answer had been closer than anyone imagined. And after 30 years of silence, the past was finally beginning to speak. But uncovering the truth was only the beginning. The next challenge would be proving it. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. For decades, Emily Carter's disappearance remained a wound that never closed. The years changed the town. Buildings were torn down. Families moved away. Children who once searched the streets for answers grew into adults with children of their own. But one thing never changed. The question, what happened to Emily? Now, after 30 years of silence, investigators were finally standing in front of a door that had remained locked for generations. And behind that door was a truth that would reshape everything. The new investigation focused on a name that had appeared in the original case files, but had never become a central part of the search. Daniel Reeves. In 1993, Reeves was considered only a minor figure in the investigation. He was someone who had crossed paths with Emily shortly before she vanished. A person who knew her schedule. A person who had spoken with her that week. A person investigators had interviewed briefly before moving in another direction. At the time, there was nothing strong enough to connect him to Emily's disappearance. No direct evidence. No witness who could place him at the scene. No physical proof. The case moved forward without him. And eventually it stopped moving at all. But decades later, investigators saw the old information differently. The original detectives had worked with the tools they had available. They followed the evidence as it existed in 1993. But modern investigators had something those detectives never had: time, technology, and the ability to look back with a completely different perspective. When they reviewed the old interviews, they noticed small inconsistencies. Not dramatic contradictions. Not obvious lies. Small details. The kind of details that can disappear in the noise of a massive investigation. Reeves had changed parts of his story over the years. A location. A timeline. A conversation he claimed to remember differently. At the time, those differences seemed insignificant. Now they became impossible to ignore. Investigators began building a new timeline. They reconstructed Emily's final known movements. They mapped phone records. They examined financial activity. They reviewed witness statements from people who had moved away and believed they would never be contacted again. Slowly, a pattern appeared. The night Emily disappeared, someone had been closer to her than previously believed. Someone who knew exactly where she would be. Someone who had a reason to hide. The investigation became more intense. Detectives followed Reeves' history. They looked into his life after Emily disappeared. Where he lived. Where he worked. Who he stayed connected with. What they found created even more questions. Because while the investigation had gone cold, Reeves had continued living a normal life. He built relationships. He moved through the community. He existed among the same people who had spent years searching for Emily. And that possibility disturbed investigators more than anything. The idea that someone could carry a secret for 30 years. The idea that answers could exist while a family suffered. The idea that the person responsible could wake up every morning and continue living as if nothing had happened. But suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed evidence. The kind of evidence that could finally bring justice. So they returned to the physical evidence. The evidence collected in 1993. For years, those items had been stored away. Forgotten by some. Preserved by others. Waiting for technology to catch up. One of those items became the center of the investigation. A piece of material recovered from Emily's vehicle. At the time, testing produced no usable results. But advances in forensic science had transformed criminal investigations. DNA analysis could now reveal information that investigators in the 1990s could only imagine. The evidence was submitted for advanced testing. And then came the waiting. For Emily's family, every day carried uncertainty. They had experienced hope before. They had heard promises before. They knew that cold cases often reopened only to close again. But this time felt different. Investigators were no longer searching blindly. They had direction. They had a suspect. And they had evidence. Then the laboratory results arrived. The discovery was described by investigators as the moment the case changed forever. The forensic evidence revealed a connection. A connection that had not existed in the original investigation. A connection that pointed directly toward the person detectives had been investigating. Daniel Reeves. For the first time in 3 decades, Emily Carter's case was no longer just a mystery. It was a criminal investigation with a clear target. But even then, investigators knew the hardest part was still ahead. They had to confront a question that haunts every cold case investigation. Why now? Why did it take 30 years? Why did the answer remain hidden for so long? The truth was complicated. Cases evolve. Technology changes. People remember things differently over time. And sometimes, evidence that once seemed meaningless becomes the key to everything. But for Emily's family, the science was only part of the story. They wanted accountability. They wanted the person responsible to answer for what happened. They wanted the world to know that Emily had not been forgotten. As investigators prepared the final steps of the case, the community watched closely. The story that had disappeared from headlines for decades suddenly returned. People who remembered Emily as a young woman now saw her face again. The same photograph. The same smile. The same person whose life had been interrupted. Only now there was something different. A possibility that justice was finally within reach. The cold case that had haunted an entire town was moving toward its final chapter. But before the arrest, before the courtroom, before the world learned the full truth, investigators needed one more thing. They needed to know exactly what happened on that October night in 1993. Because solving a case is not only about finding who did it. It is about uncovering the story of how it happened. And after 30 years, that story was finally beginning to emerge. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. For 30 years, the answer had existed somewhere between memory and evidence. It lived inside old reports stored in forgotten cabinets. It lived inside conversations people wished they could remember more clearly. It lived inside the silence of a community that had learned to live with uncertainty. But now the silence was breaking. Investigators had the evidence. They had a suspect, and they were closer than ever to reconstructing the final moments of Emily Carter's life. The case that had once seemed frozen in time was moving again. But every cold case carries a difficult reality. Finding a possible suspect is only the beginning. Turning suspicion into justice requires patience, precision, and proof. Investigators knew that one mistake could destroy decades of work. They knew that the defense would question everything. The evidence, the timeline, the memories, the investigation itself. So they continued carefully. Behind closed doors, detectives rebuilt the night Emily disappeared piece by piece. They started with the last confirmed moments of her life. The evening of October 14th, 1993. A normal day that became the final chapter of a story no one was prepared to tell. Emily had finished work later than usual. Several co-workers remembered seeing her leave. They remembered the weather, the rain falling across the parking lot, the sound of cars moving through wet streets. Small details that seemed meaningless at the time suddenly became important. Because in a cold case, the smallest memories can become the strongest evidence. Investigators looked at every person who had contact with Emily that day. They examined old friendships, old disagreements, old relationships. They searched for anything that could explain why someone would want to hurt her. And again, Daniel Reeves became the focus. The more investigators looked, the more uncomfortable questions appeared. Reeves had told investigators in 1993 that he had not seen Emily after that evening. But new analysis of old information created doubts about that statement. A witness who had remained silent for years came forward with a memory that changed the timeline. The witness recalled seeing Reeves near the area where Emily's vehicle was eventually found. At the time, the detail had seemed unimportant. 30 years later, it became a critical piece of the puzzle. Investigators followed the new lead. They reviewed maps. They studied travel times. They compared the witness statement with existing records. And slowly, the timeline began to close. But the investigation was not only about where Reeves was. It was about what he knew. Because knowledge can be just as revealing as physical evidence. Detectives examined statements Reeves had made over the years. They found details he should not have known. Information that had never been released publicly. Information only someone connected to the investigation could have known. The discovery sent shockwaves through the case. Investigators now faced a disturbing possibility. Had Reeves revealed information because he was involved? Or was there another explanation? They needed more. They needed something undeniable. Something that could connect the suspect directly to the crime. That evidence came from the forensic examination. The original investigators in 1993 had done everything possible with the technology available at the time. But decades later, forensic science had changed the rules. Tiny traces left behind could now tell stories that once seemed impossible to uncover. The laboratory examination produced a result investigators had hoped for, but never expected. The evidence connected Daniel Reeves to Emily's disappearance. The case had finally found its missing link. For Emily's family, the news was overwhelming. After years of waiting, they were suddenly facing the possibility that the person responsible had finally been identified. But along with relief came pain. Because solving a cold case does not erase the years lost. It does not return birthdays that passed without answers. It does not bring back the moments a family missed. Justice can arrive decades late. But time cannot be recovered. When investigators prepared to make the arrest, they knew the moment would change everything. For the community, it would reopen old memories. For Emily's family, it would bring a mixture of emotions impossible to describe. Anger, sadness, relief, and a question that had remained unanswered for 3 decades. Why? Why Emily? Why that night? Why did the truth remain hidden for so long? The answer would soon come from the investigation that followed. But first, authorities had to confront another challenge. Daniel Reeves had spent decades believing the past would stay buried. He had built a life beyond the shadow of the investigation. He had watched as years passed. He had seen the case disappear from public attention. He had seen the world move on. Until one morning, everything changed. A knock on the door. A police presence outside. A moment when the past finally arrived. The arrest of Daniel Reeves marked the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter Emily's family had waited decades to see. But it also raised new questions. What exactly happened that night? How did Reeves avoid suspicion for so long? And what finally caused the truth to come to light after 30 years? As news of the arrest spread, the town that had once whispered about Emily's disappearance now faced the reality they had waited for. The cold case was no longer cold. The mystery was no longer unsolved. But the full story had not yet been revealed. And inside the investigation files were details that would explain how a crime hidden for decades was finally uncovered. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The arrest changed everything. For 3 decades, Emily Carter's name had represented a question with no answer. A photograph on a missing person poster. A story repeated by a family desperate for closure. A cold case that many feared would remain unsolved forever. But now the impossible had happened. The person investigators believed responsible was finally in custody. And as the news spread, a community that had carried the weight of uncertainty for years was forced to confront a painful reality. The truth had been closer than anyone imagined. The arrest of Daniel Reeves shocked those who remembered the original investigation. Some people were surprised. Others were not. But almost everyone had the same reaction. After 30 years, how could this finally happen now? The answer was hidden inside decades of unanswered questions, overlooked evidence, and one final breakthrough that changed the direction of the case forever. When investigators announced the arrest, Emily's family stood together. For years, they had imagined this moment. They had imagined hearing the name of the person responsible. They had imagined knowing that someone would finally be held accountable. But reality was more complicated than they expected. Because no arrest could undo what happened. No courtroom could return the years they lost. No verdict could bring Emily back. The family had spent decades living between hope and grief. They celebrated every new lead. They feared every disappointment. They learned to protect themselves from expecting too much. And now, after so many years, the person connected to Emily's disappearance was finally facing justice. But before the trial could begin, investigators needed to reveal how the crime unfolded. They needed to answer the questions that had haunted the community since 1993. The first question was simple. What happened on the night Emily disappeared? According to investigators, the answer began with a meeting that was never supposed to happen. Emily believed she was having an ordinary conversation. A brief interaction. A moment that would not change her life. But investigators believed that moment became the turning point. They believed Reeves had planned his actions carefully. Not in a way that would immediately attract attention. Not in a way that would leave obvious signs. But enough to create confusion. Enough to delay the investigation. Enough to allow time to pass. And time became his greatest advantage. The first days after Emily vanished were filled with uncertainty. Her family searched everywhere. Authorities followed hundreds of possible leads. The community came together. But investigators now believed the person responsible was already watching the search unfold. Someone who knew exactly how desperate everyone was. Someone who knew the investigation was moving in the wrong direction. That possibility disturbed detectives. Because it meant the case had not simply gone cold. It had been hidden. As prosecutors prepared their case, they examined every piece of evidence collected over the years. The forensic results were important, but they were only one part of the story. The strength of the case came from multiple pieces connecting together. The timeline, the witness statements, the inconsistencies, the physical evidence. Each piece alone was incomplete. Together, they created a picture that investigators believed finally explained what happened. One of the most important developments came from a renewed examination of Reeves' statements. During the original investigation, detectives had considered his answers unusual, but not enough to take action. Decades later, those same answers looked different. Investigators noticed that Reeves had repeatedly adjusted his story. Small changes, small explanations, small attempts to fill gaps that investigators had not originally focused on. But when those statements were compared side by side, a pattern emerged. The story was changing, and changing stories often reveal hidden truths. Meanwhile, detectives continued speaking with people connected to Emily's life. Some conversations were difficult. Some memories had faded. Some witnesses struggled to remember events from 30 years earlier. But one thing became clear. Emily had left an impression on people. She was not forgotten. Her name still carried meaning. Friends described her as someone who cared deeply about others. Someone who believed people deserved kindness. Someone who never expected that a normal evening would become the final moment of her life. That was what made the case so painful. Emily's disappearance was not just a crime file. It was a stolen future. A future filled with birthdays never celebrated. Conversations never completed. Dreams never reached. For investigators, solving the case became more than closing an old file. It became a promise. A promise that Emily's story would not end with a missing poster and unanswered questions. As the trial preparations continued, the defense began challenging the investigation. They questioned the reliability of old memories. They questioned evidence collected decades earlier. They questioned whether investigators were seeing connections because they already suspected Reeves. It was a strategy everyone expected, because cold cases often depend on evidence gathered across different generations. And every piece must survive intense examination. But prosecutors believed the evidence told a clear story. They believed the combination of forensic science and investigative work proved that Emily's disappearance was not a mystery anymore. It was a crime with a suspect. A crime with evidence. A crime that had finally reached the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. The story that had disappeared decades earlier returned to the public eye. People across the country followed the case. They wanted to understand how someone could avoid justice for so long. They wanted to know how a mystery that seemed impossible was finally solved. And most importantly, they wanted to know what happened to Emily Carter. Because behind every headline was a family who had waited 30 years. A family who had carried unanswered questions through every stage of life. A family who finally had a chance to hear the truth. But as the courtroom prepared to open, one final mystery remained. The evidence had identified a suspect. The investigation had revealed a timeline. But the most important question still remained unanswered. What was the exact sequence of events that led to Emily's final moments? And what would the trial reveal about the night that changed everything? After 3 decades of silence, the story was finally about to be told. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The courtroom doors opened, and after 30 years of unanswered questions, the world finally had a chance to hear the story that had remained hidden for so long. For decades, Emily Carter's disappearance existed only through fragments. A missing person report. A handful of photographs. A family's desperate search. A case file filled with theories but no conclusion. Now, every piece of evidence would be placed under the brightest possible light. Every statement would be questioned. Every memory would be examined. Because in a courtroom, suspicion is not enough. A family can believe. Investigators can believe. A community can believe. But justice requires proof. And that was the challenge waiting for prosecutors. They had spent years rebuilding a case that had survived 3 decades. Now they had to convince a jury that the evidence pointed to one person and one person only. Daniel Reeves entered the courtroom, knowing the eyes of the world were on him. For years, he had lived outside the spotlight. He had avoided public suspicion. He had watched as Emily's disappearance became an old story. A tragedy people remembered but rarely discussed. But now the past was standing in front of him. The prosecution began with the timeline. Not with dramatic accusations. Not with emotional speeches. With facts. Dates. Locations. Movements. The final hours of Emily Carter's life were reconstructed piece by piece. The jury heard about the woman Emily was before she became the center of a decades-long mystery. They heard about her work, her relationships, her plans, her family. The prosecution wanted the jury to understand something important. Emily was not simply a victim in a case file. She was a person whose life had been interrupted. A person whose future was taken away. Then came the evidence. The forensic findings that reopened the investigation. The discovery that transformed an old missing person case into a criminal investigation. The evidence collected decades earlier had been preserved. And when modern technology examined what investigators in 1993 could not, it revealed a connection that changed everything. The defense immediately challenged the reliability of that evidence. They argued that too much time had passed. They questioned how evidence stored for decades could be trusted. They suggested that investigators were trying to force old pieces into a new theory. But prosecutors argued something different. They said time did not weaken the evidence. Time preserved it. The truth had waited until science was advanced enough to reveal it. The courtroom listened as experts explained how forensic technology had changed. How information once impossible to discover could now be uncovered from the smallest traces. For many watching the trial, it was a reminder of how many cold cases had remained unsolved not because the truth did not exist, but because investigators did not yet have the tools to find it. But the prosecution's case was not built on science alone. They presented witnesses. People who remembered Emily. People who remembered the days after she disappeared. People who remembered details that had seemed insignificant years earlier. One witness described seeing Reeves near an area connected to the investigation. Another explained a conversation that had always felt unusual. Another described changes in Reeves' behavior after Emily vanished. The defense questioned every witness. They pointed out the difficulty of remembering events after 30 years. They reminded the jury that memory can change, that details can become unclear, that time can affect the way people remember the past. And they were right about one thing. 30 years is a long time. Long enough for memories to fade. Long enough for people to move away. Long enough for evidence to become harder to understand. But investigators believed that was exactly why the case had required so much patience. Because not every answer arrives quickly. Some answers take decades. As the trial continued, one moment became the focus of intense attention. A statement Daniel Reeves had made years earlier. A statement investigators believed revealed knowledge he should never have had. The prosecution argued that this information could only have come from someone connected to Emily's disappearance. The defense offered another explanation. They argued that the detail was misunderstood, that investigators were interpreting the past through the lens of what they knew now. The jury had to decide. Was this a mistake? A coincidence? Or a sign that Reeves knew more than he admitted? Outside the courthouse, public attention grew. News reports followed every development. People who had forgotten Emily's name began learning her story. Online discussions spread. Old photographs circulated again. The community that had once searched for answers now watched as those answers were debated inside a courtroom. For Emily's family, every day brought a mixture of emotions. They listened to details they had waited years to hear. But hearing the truth also meant facing the pain they had carried for decades. They remembered the young woman Emily had been. Not just the case. Not just the investigation. Not just the tragedy. They remembered her laugh. Her kindness. The small moments that made her who she was. And those memories made the courtroom moments even harder. Because justice was finally approaching. But nothing could change the fact that Emily had been gone for 30 years. As closing arguments approached, both sides prepared their final message to the jury. The prosecution believed the evidence created a clear path from Emily's disappearance to Daniel Reeves. The defense believed doubt remained. They argued that a case built decades later could never be certain. The jury would soon have to answer the question that had haunted the community for generations. Was this finally the truth? Or was another mystery about to begin? After 30 years, the search for answers had reached its most important moment. A verdict was coming, and when it arrived, it would determine whether Emily Carter's family would finally receive the justice they had waited for. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned. For everyone watching, this was the moment that had been approaching for 30 years. A verdict would not erase the past. It would not return the years Emily Carter's family had lost. It would not undo the pain carried through birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that were never the same again. But it would answer one question that had followed the community for decades. Would the person responsible finally be held accountable? The jury had spent days reviewing evidence. They had listened to experts explain forensic findings. They had heard witnesses describe memories from a time most people had already forgotten. They had examined the timeline, the statements, the contradictions, the evidence that transformed an abandoned investigation into one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in the region. Now they had reached their decision. Daniel Reeves sat quietly as the courtroom waited. The man who had once been only a name in an old investigation file was now at the center of a case that had captured national attention. For years, Emily's family had wondered if they would ever see this day. Many families of cold case victims never do. Many never receive answers. Many never see a courtroom. But Emily's story had taken a different path. The judge asked the jury if they had reached a verdict. The answer was yes. The room became completely still. Then the decision was read. Guilty. A single word. But for Emily's family, it carried the weight of 3 decades. 3 decades of searching. 3 decades of questions. 3 decades of wondering whether the truth would ever be known. Some people in the courtroom cried. Others sat silently. For a moment, no one moved. Because even after justice arrives, grief does not disappear. A conviction can bring accountability. It can bring answers. But it cannot restore what was lost. Emily Carter was still gone. Her family still had memories they could never recreate. Her future still existed only in imagination. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as the news spread. A cold case that had remained unsolved for decades was finally closed. The headline that once seemed impossible became reality. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. But behind the headline was a much deeper story. A story about persistence. About evidence surviving through time. About investigators who refused to accept that an unanswered question had to remain unanswered forever. The case became an example of how cold cases can change. How technology can reopen doors that appear permanently closed. How a single piece of evidence can wait years before revealing its meaning. But the investigation did not end with the verdict. There were still questions. Questions about how the case remained unsolved for so long. Questions about whether anything could have been done differently. Questions about whether Emily's family could have received justice sooner. Those questions remained. Because every cold case carries 2 timelines. The timeline of the crime. And the timeline of the search for the truth. For Emily, the first timeline ended on a night in October 1993. But the second timeline continued for 30 years. It continued through investigators who refused to forget. Through family members who kept speaking her name. Through evidence stored away and waiting for the right moment. The final chapter of the investigation revealed something investigators had known all along. Cold cases are never truly silent. They may go years without movement. They may disappear from public attention. They may seem impossible to solve. But the truth can remain hidden, waiting. Waiting for new technology. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. Waiting for someone willing to look again. For Emily's parents, the verdict brought a complicated kind of peace. They had spent years imagining what justice would feel like. They imagined feeling only relief. But the reality was different. There was relief. There was gratitude. But there was also sadness. Because justice arrived alongside the reminder of everything they had lost. They would never hear Emily's voice again. Never see her walk through the front door. Never watch the life she should have lived unfold. The verdict answered one question. But it created another. How do families move forward after waiting decades for the truth? The answer is different for everyone. Some find comfort in knowing the person responsible was held accountable. Some find comfort in preserving memories. Some dedicate themselves to helping other families searching for answers. Emily's family chose to keep her memory alive. They wanted people to remember who she was before the tragedy. Not just the woman from a cold case report. Not just the face connected to an investigation. But Emily. The daughter. The friend. The person whose life mattered. Years after her disappearance, her name returned to the headlines. But this time, it was not because she was missing. It was because she had been found in the only way possible. Through the truth. The investigation became a reminder that time does not erase every secret. Sometimes time reveals them. Sometimes the evidence needed to solve a case already exists. It simply waits for the moment when someone knows how to find it. And for the community that had carried Emily's disappearance for decades, that moment finally came. The cold case was solved. The questions had answers. The family finally received justice. But the story of Emily Carter would continue to live on. Because behind every solved case is a reminder of what was lost. And behind every headline is a person whose life mattered long before they became a mystery. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The verdict closed the legal chapter of the Emily Carter case. But for those who had lived through the uncertainty, the investigation never felt like just a case. It was a story about time. About loss. About a family that spent decades searching for a person they loved. and about a community that refused to let a forgotten name disappear. After the conviction of Daniel Reeves, investigators released more details about how the case had finally been solved. The breakthrough did not come from one dramatic discovery. It came from years of persistence, from reviewing what others had overlooked, from asking new questions about old evidence, from understanding that a cold case is not a dead case. It is a case waiting for the right moment. The evidence that changed everything had existed for decades. The difference was that technology had finally caught up. When the original investigation began in 1993, detectives worked with the tools available at the time. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They followed every possible lead. But some answers remained hidden. Not because investigators did not care. Not because they stopped searching. But because some secrets cannot be uncovered until science learns how to reveal them. That became one of the most important lessons from Emily's case. Time had not destroyed the evidence. Time had preserved it. The same evidence that once seemed useless became the foundation of a breakthrough. For many investigators, that was the most powerful part of the story. The answer had always been there. Waiting. The days after the verdict brought a strange feeling to the town. For years, Emily's disappearance had been a question everyone carried. People remembered where they were when she vanished. They remembered the search efforts. They remembered the fear that spread through the community. Now, they were living through a different moment. The mystery had ended, but the memories remained. Neighbors who had once searched roads and fields spoke about the case again. People who had been children in 1993 remembered the posters and news reports. A new generation learned the story for the first time. And many asked the same question. How could something like this happen? How could a person disappear and leave behind decades of unanswered questions? The answer was not simple. Cold cases are rarely simple. They are built from countless moments. A missed detail. A forgotten conversation. A witness who stays silent. A piece of evidence that cannot yet speak. And sometimes one decision made years earlier changes everything. For investigators who worked on Emily's case, the final resolution was not only about arresting a suspect. It was about honoring the promise made at the beginning. A promise that Emily would not become just another unsolved case. That someone would continue looking. That someone would continue asking questions. That someone would continue searching for the truth. Behind the investigation were countless hours that the public never saw. Detectives studying old reports late at night. Analysts comparing records. Experts examining evidence. People who spent months rebuilding a timeline from events that happened decades earlier. Cold case investigations require patience because every step carries the weight of history. Investigators are not only solving a crime. They are reopening a chapter of someone's life. They are returning to moments filled with pain. They are asking people to remember things they tried to leave behind. That responsibility shaped the way Emily's case was handled. Every detail mattered. Every decision mattered. Because after 30 years, there was no room for mistakes. The conviction also brought attention to other families still waiting for answers. Across the country, thousands of cold cases remain open. Families continue searching. Photographs remain displayed. Questions remain unanswered. Emily's case became a symbol of hope for people who still believe their loved ones will not be forgotten. Because if a case that remained silent for 30 years could finally be solved, then other cases might still have a chance. The story also changed the way many people viewed old investigations. Some believed that if a case went unsolved for decades, the truth was probably gone forever. Emily's case proved otherwise. A cold case is not a story that ended. It is a story paused. And sometimes the smallest discovery can restart everything. Months after the trial, Emily's family returned to places connected to her life. Not to search, not to ask questions, but to remember. They visited places where Emily had laughed. Places where she had created memories before the night that changed everything. For them, the most important part of justice was not the headlines. It was knowing that Emily's story was finally complete. She was no longer missing. Her name was no longer attached to uncertainty. The world now knew what happened. And while the truth was painful, it was better than silence. Because silence had been the hardest part. For 30 years, silence left room for endless possibilities. Now there was an answer. A painful answer. But an answer. The community slowly moved forward. The conversations changed. People no longer asked whether Emily's case would ever be solved. They talked about what her life meant. They talked about the importance of remembering victims. They talked about the investigators who refused to give up. And they talked about the lesson that remained after all those years. Some mysteries are not solved because they are impossible. They are solved because someone refuses to stop searching. The Emily Carter case began as a disappearance that shocked a small town. It became a cold case that seemed destined to remain unsolved. And decades later, it became a reminder that justice can take time. Sometimes years. Sometimes generations. But the truth has a way of returning. Even after decades of silence. Even after memories fade. Even after the world believes a case has been forgotten. Because every unanswered question leaves behind a trace. And sometimes, that trace is enough to bring the truth home. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines began to disappear, one question remained in the minds of many people who followed the Emily Carter case. How did a mystery that survived 30 years finally reveal its secrets? The answer was not hidden in one dramatic moment. It was hidden in the patience of investigators, in the memories of people who refused to forget, in evidence that waited silently through decades of change, and in the determination to look again when everyone else believed there was nothing left to find. The investigation that solved Emily's case became a powerful reminder of one truth in criminal investigations. Time does not always destroy answers. Sometimes time protects them. When detectives first reopened the case, they understood the challenge ahead. They were not investigating a recent crime. They were stepping into the past. A past filled with incomplete memories, outdated technology, and unanswered questions. Every decision made in 1993 had to be examined. Every assumption had to be challenged. Every possibility had to be considered again. Because the original investigation was not a failure. It was a different era. Investigators in the early 1990s did not have the advanced forensic tools available today. They could only work with what they had. And what they had was a mystery, a missing woman, an abandoned vehicle, a community searching for answers, a family waiting for someone to explain the impossible. But decades later, investigators approached the case with a new understanding. They knew that old evidence could become new evidence. They knew that forgotten details could become important. They knew that every cold case carried the possibility of discovery. The renewed investigation also changed the way people looked at the past. Many witnesses who had remained silent for years began to reconsider what they remembered. Some had believed their information was not important. Some had assumed investigators already knew. Some simply thought too much time had passed for anything to matter. But detectives understood something important. In a cold case, there is no such thing as an insignificant detail. A sentence spoken 30 years ago. A location remembered incorrectly. A conversation someone thought was meaningless. Any of those things could become the missing piece. That philosophy helped investigators rebuild Emily's final days. They created a new timeline. Not based on old assumptions. Based on everything available. They studied where Emily had been. Who she had spoken with. What movements could be confirmed. What information did not match. Slowly, the picture became clearer. And with every discovery, one reality became harder to ignore. Emily's disappearance was not a mystery without clues. It was a mystery with hidden clues. The difference was enormous. Because hidden clues can be found. The investigation also revealed the emotional cost of a cold case. For Emily's family, solving the case meant reopening memories they had carried for decades. The world often sees the final moment of a criminal case. The arrest. The trial. The verdict. But families live through every moment before that. The waiting. The uncertainty. The unanswered phone calls. The possibility that tomorrow might finally bring news. And the fear that tomorrow might bring nothing at all. For 30 years, Emily's family experienced both hope and disappointment. They watched other cases receive answers. They watched other families find closure. And they wondered if their own story would ever have that ending. When investigators finally returned with the breakthrough, the family had to process emotions that were impossible to separate. They were grateful. They were heartbroken. They were relieved. They were angry. All at the same time. Because justice does not erase grief. It exists beside it. The conviction of Daniel Reeves answered the question of responsibility. But it also raised questions about the years before the breakthrough. Could the case have been solved earlier? Was there a moment when the truth was within reach? Those questions continue to appear in many cold cases. Because every unsolved investigation leaves behind a painful possibility. The possibility that the answer existed somewhere. Waiting. For Emily's case, the turning point came when investigators combined old-fashioned detective work with modern technology. The evidence alone was not enough. The interviews alone were not enough. The timeline alone was not enough. But together, they created a story that could no longer be ignored. That became the foundation of the prosecution's case. A case built not on one piece of information, but on a chain of evidence. A chain that connected the past to the present. The success of the investigation also brought attention to the importance of preserving evidence. Across the country, law enforcement agencies continue to maintain evidence from decades-old cases. Some of those cases appear impossible. Some appear forgotten. But investigators know that evidence does not have an expiration date. A sample collected years ago may hold answers today. A photograph may reveal something missed before. A document may contain a detail that changes everything. Technology continues to evolve. And with every advancement, more cold cases have the possibility of being reopened. The Emily Carter case became part of that larger conversation. A reminder that victims should not become forgotten names. A reminder that families deserve answers. A reminder that justice is not limited by time. But beyond the investigation, beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, there was still one person at the center of everything. Emily. Before the case. Before the mystery. Before the headlines. There was a woman with dreams, relationships, and a life that mattered. That was what her family wanted people to remember. Not only how she disappeared, but who she was. Because every cold case begins with a person. Someone who was loved. Someone who had a future. Someone whose story deserves to be told. And after 30 years, Emily Carter's story was finally complete. The mystery had an ending. The silence had been broken. The truth had finally arrived. But the impact of the case would continue long after the final court documents were filed. Because some stories do more than reveal what happened. They change how people understand justice. They change how communities remember. And they remind everyone that even the oldest cold cases can still have a final chapter. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The final chapter of the Emily Carter case was no longer about searching. It was about remembering. For 30 years, the investigation had been defined by uncertainty. A missing woman. A family waiting. A community searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. But after the conviction of Daniel Reeves, the story entered a different stage. The questions that once dominated every conversation had finally been answered. Where was Emily? What happened that night? Who was responsible? But one question remained more powerful than all the others. Why did it take so long? The answer revealed one of the most difficult realities of cold case investigations. Truth does not always arrive when people need it most. Sometimes it arrives years later. Sometimes it arrives after families have spent decades wondering if they will ever know what happened. Sometimes it arrives when the people who started searching are no longer alive to see the ending. That was the tragedy behind many unsolved cases. Time does not only challenge investigators. It challenges families. It challenges communities. It challenges the hope that an answer will ever come. Emily's case survived because people refused to let time erase her. Her name remained in police records. Her photograph remained in family albums. Her memory remained alive in the people who loved her. That persistence became one of the most important parts of the investigation. Because cold cases are not solved only through evidence. They are solved through commitment. Someone has to believe that the truth is still there. Someone has to look again. Someone has to ask the question everyone else stopped asking. When investigators reviewed Emily's case decades later, they were not simply reopening an old file. They were reopening a promise. A promise that every missing person deserves to be found. A promise that every victim deserves justice. A promise that no family should have to spend a lifetime wondering. The investigation also changed how the community viewed the past. For years, people had carried different theories. Some believed Emily had left voluntarily. Some believed a stranger was responsible. Some believed the truth would never be discovered. Those theories existed because there were no answers. And when answers are missing, people create their own explanations. But the truth is often different from what anyone expects. The reality revealed through the investigation was not a simple story. It was a story of decisions, moments, choices, and consequences that unfolded over decades. The conviction of Daniel Reeves brought justice, but it also forced the community to confront a painful thought. The person responsible had been living among them. Someone they might have seen. Someone they might have passed on the street. Someone who carried the secret while others searched. That realization was difficult for many people to accept, because the most frightening mysteries are not always about unknown strangers. Sometimes the truth hides behind familiar faces. The case also showed how investigations change over time. In 1993, detectives searched for answers using the methods available to them. They followed leads. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They did the work necessary to move the investigation forward. But decades later, a new generation of investigators continued the search with new tools. Advanced forensic analysis, improved databases, modern investigative techniques. The combination of old information and new technology created the breakthrough. A reminder that solving a cold case is often a partnership between the past and the present. The evidence came from one era. The answers came from another. And together they revealed the truth. For Emily's family, the years after the conviction brought a different kind of healing. There was no celebration, no moment that erased everything. Instead, there was acceptance. They finally knew. For years, uncertainty had been the hardest part. Not knowing where Emily was. Not knowing what happened. Not knowing whether justice would ever come. The truth was painful. But uncertainty had been its own kind of suffering. Now they could grieve with answers. They could remember Emily without the shadow of a question hanging over every memory. They could speak her name knowing that the world finally understood her story. The case also inspired renewed attention toward other families still searching. People who saw Emily's story began asking about their own unanswered cases. They wondered whether old evidence connected to their loved ones might still hold answers. They wondered whether their own impossible mysteries could one day be solved. And investigators wanted them to know one thing. A cold case is never just a file. It represents a person, a family, a life interrupted. Every case has a story. Every piece of evidence has a history. Every unanswered question belongs to someone. That was the lasting impact of Emily Carter's case. It was not only about one investigation. It was about every family still waiting. Every name still written on a missing person report. Every photograph still displayed with hope. Every question still unanswered. Because justice delayed does not mean justice impossible. The story of Emily Carter began with a disappearance that shocked a small town. It continued through decades of silence. It survived through uncertainty. And it ended with a truth that finally reached the people who had waited the longest. Her family, the community, and everyone who believed that no case should be forgotten. But even after justice was served, one final message remained. The most important part of any cold case is not the mystery. It is the person behind it. Emily was never just a case number. Never just a headline. Never just a photograph in an investigation file. She was someone who mattered. Someone who was loved. Someone whose story deserved an ending. And after 30 years, that ending finally arrived. The cold case was solved. The truth was revealed. And a family that had spent decades waiting finally received the justice they had fought so hard to find. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. Years after the courtroom verdict, the name Emily Carter continued to represent something much larger than a single criminal investigation. It became a symbol of patience, a symbol of persistence, a symbol of the belief that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still be found. But behind the headlines and the public attention was a quieter story. The story of what happens after justice arrives. Because when a cold case is solved, many people believe the journey is over. The suspect is identified. The trial ends. The verdict is delivered. The cameras leave. But for the families left behind, life continues with a complicated mixture of emotions. There is relief. There is sadness. There is the strange reality of finally knowing what happened after spending years imagining every possible answer. For Emily's family, the end of the investigation did not mean forgetting. It meant remembering in a different way. For decades, every memory of Emily existed alongside a question. A photograph was not just a photograph. It was a reminder. A birthday was not just a birthday. It was another year without answers. A familiar song, a favorite place, a simple family tradition could bring back the pain of not knowing. But after the case was solved, something changed. The memories were still painful. The loss was still real. But the uncertainty was gone. And for many families of cold case victims, that difference means everything. The investigation into Emily's disappearance also changed the way law enforcement approached old cases. It showed that time should not be viewed as the enemy. Instead, time can sometimes become an unexpected advantage. People change. Technology improves. New methods become available. Old evidence gains new meaning. A detail that once seemed unimportant can become the center of an entire investigation. That lesson reached far beyond one town. Across the country, investigators revisited old cases. They searched through forgotten evidence. They reviewed reports written decades earlier. They looked at unsolved mysteries with a new perspective. Because Emily's case proved that closure is sometimes waiting behind one more question. One more review. One more attempt. The detectives who worked on the reopened investigation often described the process as rebuilding a story. Not creating a new one. Rebuilding the one that had been there all along. The truth existed. It had always existed. The challenge was finding the path that connected all the pieces. And those pieces were scattered across 30 years. A statement from 1993. A forensic discovery decades later. A memory that resurfaced. A record that revealed a hidden connection. Each detail carried a small part of the story. Together, they created the answer. The case also reminded investigators of the importance of listening. Because some of the most valuable information in a cold case does not come from technology. It comes from people. Witnesses. Family members. Friends. People who carry memories for years without realizing those memories might matter. A person may remember a conversation from decades earlier. A strange moment. A small detail. Something they dismissed at the time. But years later, that same detail can become the missing piece. That was one of the most powerful lessons from Emily's case. The truth is often hidden in places people stop looking. The investigation also had a lasting impact on the community. For years, Emily's disappearance had represented fear. A reminder that someone could vanish without explanation. A reminder that some questions might never be answered. But after the case was solved, the community began viewing the story differently. Emily was no longer only remembered because of what happened to her. She was remembered because of who she was. Friends shared stories about her personality. Family members talked about her dreams. People who never met her learned about the life she had before the tragedy. That was important, because victims of crime are often reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. Their names become connected to investigations. Their faces become connected to headlines. But before the crime, they were people. They had plans. They had relationships. They had moments that mattered. Emily's story returned to that truth. She was not only the woman at the center of a cold case. She was Emily, and that was how her family wanted her remembered. The years after the conviction also brought reflection about the challenges of solving crimes decades later. Cold cases require enormous resources. They require dedication from investigators. They require cooperation between agencies. And they require patience from families who may wait years, even generations, for answers. Not every case receives the same ending. Many families are still waiting. Many investigations remain open. Many questions remain unanswered. But Emily's story offered something rare. Hope. The hope that silence does not always win. The hope that evidence can survive. The hope that a name written in an old file can one day return to the headlines for the right reason. Because solving a cold case is about more than identifying a suspect. It is about restoring a piece of a family's story. It is about giving a victim back their voice. It is about proving that time does not erase the value of a life. Emily Carter's case began as a mystery. It became a decades-long search. It ended as a lesson that every unanswered question matters. Every victim matters. Every family waiting for answers matters. And sometimes, after years of silence, the truth does not disappear. It waits, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to believe, waiting for the moment when a cold case finally becomes a solved one. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. 30 years after Emily Carter disappeared, the question that had haunted a family, a community, and the investigators who refused to forget finally had an answer. The case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved had reached its final chapter. A name that had lived for decades inside a missing person report had become the center of a completed investigation. A mystery that survived through generations had finally been replaced by the truth. But the ending of Emily's story was not only about an arrest. It was not only about a conviction. It was about something deeper. It was about remembering the person who had been missing from the world for so long. Before she became a headline. Before her name appeared in investigation files. Before strangers learned her story. Emily Carter was simply Emily. A daughter. A friend. A person with dreams, plans, and a future she deserved to live. That was the part her family wanted the world to understand. The crime had taken away years. It had taken away moments that could never return. But it would never take away who Emily was. And that became the final message left behind after the case was solved. A victim is never just a victim. A cold case is never just a file. Behind every unanswered question is a human life. Behind every investigation is a family waiting. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. The resolution of Emily's case also revealed something about justice itself. Many people imagine justice as a single moment. A dramatic arrest. A courtroom announcement. A verdict. But real justice is often much slower. It is built through thousands of small actions. A detective reviewing an old document. An analyst examining evidence again. A witness deciding to finally speak. A family choosing to keep searching. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes, it moves quietly for years before the world finally sees the result. That was what happened with Emily Carter. For decades, the investigation appeared frozen. But beneath the surface, the possibility of answers remained. The evidence was preserved. The questions remained. The possibility of discovery never completely disappeared. And when the right people looked again, the case began moving forward. The story also became a reminder of the power of modern forensic science. Technology did not replace investigation. It strengthened it. The tools available today allowed investigators to see what previous generations could not. Evidence that once appeared silent could finally speak. Information that once seemed impossible to recover could finally reveal the truth. But technology alone was not enough. A machine could analyze evidence. A database could identify connections. But people had to decide to look. People had to care enough to reopen the past. People had to believe that Emily's story deserved another chance. That belief changed everything. For the investigators involved, solving the case was a responsibility. They knew that every cold case represents someone waiting. Someone hoping. Someone wondering if the person they lost will ever receive justice. Emily's case gave those families a reason to continue believing. Because if a case could remain unanswered for 30 years and still be solved, then no investigation should ever be considered hopeless. The impact reached beyond the town where Emily lived. People across the country followed the story. They saw the pain of a family waiting. They saw the dedication of investigators. They saw the power of persistence. And they were reminded of something simple but important. Every person deserves to be remembered. Every life deserves to matter. Every unanswered question deserves attention. Years after the investigation ended, Emily's name remained connected to the case. But it was connected differently. It was no longer a symbol of uncertainty. It was no longer a reminder of unanswered questions. It became a symbol of resolution. A symbol of a family that finally received the truth. A symbol of investigators who refused to stop. A symbol of the idea that justice can arrive even after decades of silence. But perhaps the most powerful part of Emily's story was not how the case was solved. It was why it mattered. Because solving a crime is not only about closing a file. It is about acknowledging a life. It is about telling the world that someone was here. Someone was loved. Someone mattered. Emily Carter's story began with a disappearance that shocked a community. It continued through years of uncertainty. It survived through decades of waiting. And it ended with the truth finally reaching the people who needed it most. Her family. The investigators. The community that never completely forgot her. The cold case was solved. The mystery was answered. The justice that once seemed impossible finally arrived. But the memory of Emily would continue beyond the courtroom. Because some stories do not end when the investigation ends. Some stories continue through the people who remember. Through the lessons they leave behind. through the hope they give to others still searching. And that may be the most important part of any cold case story. Not only discovering what happened, but proving that even after years of silence, the truth can still be found. Even after decades. Even after the world moves on. Even after a mystery seems impossible to solve. The truth can still return. And when it does, it brings something every family deserves. An answer. A memory restored. And finally, justice. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The verdict had been delivered. The courtroom had emptied. The headlines had faded. But the story of Emily Carter was not finished. Because some cases do not truly end when the judge makes a decision. Some cases continue through the memories they leave behind. Months after the conviction, the town where Emily once lived began to change. The conversations changed. The questions changed. For decades, people had spoken about Emily as a mystery. A disappearance. An unanswered question that followed the community like a shadow. But after the truth was revealed, something shifted. People began speaking about Emily differently. They talked about the person she was before the tragedy. They remembered her kindness, her ambition, the small moments that showed who she really was. The world had spent years asking what happened to Emily Carter. Now, people were finally remembering who Emily Carter had been. And that distinction mattered. Because every cold case carries a danger. Over time, the victim can become buried beneath the investigation. The evidence. The theories. The headlines. But Emily was never just a case number. She was never just a photograph attached to a missing person report. She was someone with a life. Someone with dreams. Someone whose story began long before the night she disappeared. For her family, this became the most important message after the trial. They wanted people to remember Emily as a person, not only as a victim. They wanted future generations to know her name for the right reasons. Not because of the tragedy that ended her life, but because of the life she lived before it. The investigation also changed the way many people viewed cold cases. For years, some believed that if a crime remained unsolved long enough, the truth was probably gone forever. Emily's case proved otherwise. It showed that unanswered questions can survive, that evidence can wait, that investigators can return years later and discover what earlier generations could not. The case became a reminder that time does not erase every secret. Sometimes time reveals them. The detectives who worked on the case continued receiving messages from people across the country. Families connected to other unsolved cases reached out. They shared stories. They asked questions. They searched for hope. Because Emily's case gave people something rare. A reason to believe again. A reason to keep looking. A reason to believe that an old file does not mean a forgotten person. But investigators also understood the difficult reality. Not every cold case receives the ending Emily's family received. Thousands of families continue waiting. Thousands of names remain attached to unanswered questions. Thousands of investigations remain open. That was why Emily's story mattered. It was not only about one solved case. It was about every person still waiting for answers. Every family still searching. Every investigator still following a lead that might finally unlock the truth. The legacy of the case became larger than the crime itself. It became a lesson about persistence, about the importance of preserving evidence, about the responsibility to continue searching, about the power of asking one more question. Because sometimes the difference between an unsolved mystery and a solved case is not a massive discovery. Sometimes it is a single detail, a single conversation, a single decision to look again. Years after the investigation ended, Emily's family returned to places connected to her memory. Not to search for clues, not to chase answers, but to remember. They visited places where Emily had laughed, places where she had created memories, places where her life existed before the tragedy changed everything. For the first time in decades, those memories were not surrounded by uncertainty. The questions were gone. The waiting was over. The silence had ended. And while the pain remained, there was something the family had never had before. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from forgetting. The kind that comes from knowing. Knowing what happened. Knowing who was responsible. Knowing that Emily's story would never again be unfinished. The case that once represented unanswered questions now represented something different. A reminder. A warning. A message. That every life matters. That every victim deserves to be remembered. that justice may arrive slowly, but the search for truth is always worth continuing. The world first learned Emily Carter's name because she disappeared. But she would be remembered because she was found. Not physically, not in the way anyone wished, but through the truth, through justice, through the memory of a life that mattered. And that was the final chapter of the cold case that haunted a community for 3 decades. A case that began with silence. A case that survived through hope. A case that ended with answers. Because sometimes the oldest mysteries are not forgotten. They are simply waiting for the moment when someone finally knows where to look. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The investigation was over. The courtroom battles were finished. The evidence had been examined, the verdict had been delivered, and the name that had remained hidden for decades was finally known. But for the people who lived through the Emily Carter case, one truth remained clear. A solved case does not mean a forgotten story. Some stories continue because they change the people who hear them. They become warnings. They become lessons. They become reminders of how fragile life can be and how important it is to keep searching when answers seem impossible to find. Years after the conviction, investigators continued to receive questions about the case. People wanted to know how a mystery could survive for so long. How could evidence remain unnoticed? How could a person connected to a crime move through life while a family waited for answers? Those questions were not easy to answer, because the reality of cold cases is rarely simple. There is no single reason a case goes unsolved. Sometimes evidence is limited. Sometimes witnesses disappear. Sometimes memories change. Sometimes technology has not yet reached the point where the truth can be uncovered. And sometimes the answer is hidden behind a detail that no one realized mattered. That was the story of Emily Carter. A case built from thousands of small moments. A case where the past and present eventually collided. A case where a forgotten detail became the beginning of justice. The investigators who worked on the case often reflected on one important lesson. Never assume a cold case is finished. A case may become quiet. It may disappear from newspapers. It may sit untouched for years. But as long as evidence exists and someone continues looking, the possibility of answers remains. That belief became the foundation of the renewed investigation. They did not know if they would succeed. They did not know if the truth would ever be proven. They only knew that Emily deserved another attempt. And that decision changed everything. For the community, the case also changed the way people understood memory. For decades, residents had carried pieces of Emily's story. A conversation, a location, a moment they witnessed. Most people believed those memories had lost their value. But investigators discovered something different. Time does not always destroy memories. Sometimes it changes their meaning. A detail that seems ordinary in one moment can become significant years later. A sentence that seems harmless can reveal something hidden. A forgotten encounter can become the bridge between a mystery and an answer. That became one of the most powerful lessons from the case. Everyone remembers differently, but everyone remembers something. And sometimes that is enough. The impact of Emily's story reached beyond the town where she lived. People who followed the case began looking differently at other unresolved investigations. Families searching for missing loved ones found renewed determination. Advocates for victims used the case as an example of why old investigations should continue receiving attention. And investigators saw a reminder of their responsibility. Because behind every cold case is a person who once had plans. Someone who had a favorite song. A favorite place. A person who made someone laugh. A person who mattered. Emily's name became connected to those ideas. Not only because of what happened to her, but because people refused to allow her story to disappear. For her family, the years after the trial were about rebuilding life around the truth. They no longer had to wonder. They no longer had to imagine endless possibilities. They no longer had to ask whether the world would ever know what happened. The truth was painful, but it was real. And reality, even when heartbreaking, gave them something uncertainty never could. A place to begin healing. They created new ways to honor Emily's memory. They shared stories. They protected photographs. They spoke about the person she had been before the tragedy. Because they knew something important. The final chapter of Emily's life should not be defined only by the night she disappeared. It should include every moment before that. Every smile. Every friendship. Every dream. Every part of the person she was. That was the legacy left behind. Not fear. Not only sadness. But remembrance. The Emily Carter case became a reminder that justice is not measured only by how quickly it arrives. Sometimes justice takes years. Sometimes decades. But the search still matters. The effort still matters. The person still matters. And perhaps the most powerful message from the entire investigation was this. A mystery may become old, but a life is never forgotten. The case that once seemed impossible became proof that even the deepest silence can eventually be broken. The evidence was found. The truth was revealed. The questions were answered. And after 30 years of waiting, Emily Carter's story finally reached the ending her family had fought for. Not an ending filled with celebration. Not an ending without pain. But an ending filled with something they had needed for decades. The truth. Decades-old cold case solved. Family finally gets long-awaited justice. The years continued to pass. The headlines became quieter. The courtroom recordings were archived. The investigators who worked on the case moved forward to other investigations. But the name Emily Carter remained. Not as a mystery. Not as an unanswered question. But as a reminder of what can happen when people refuse to stop searching. For decades, Emily's disappearance represented everything a family feared most. A life interrupted. A future stolen. A question with no answer. But after the investigation was reopened and the truth was revealed, her story became something different. A story of persistence. A story of discovery. A story about the moment when the past finally caught up with the present. The case also changed the way many people viewed time. Before Emily's investigation was solved, some believed that years could erase evidence. That memories would disappear. That old crimes would remain permanently hidden. But the truth proved more complicated. Time can create distance. It can create obstacles. But it can also create opportunities. Technology advances. Investigators gain new perspectives. Old information can be examined with new understanding. And sometimes, the smallest overlooked detail can survive long enough to become the answer. That was the unexpected power of Emily's case. The evidence had waited. The truth had waited. The opportunity had waited. And when the moment finally came, everything changed. For the investigators involved, the case became a defining moment in their careers. Not because it was easy, because it was not. Cold case investigations are built on uncertainty. There are no guarantees. There are no promises that every question will have an answer. Every lead carries the possibility of disappointment. Every discovery carries the risk that it may lead nowhere. But investigators continued because they understood something important. Behind every file is a family. Behind every photograph is a person. Behind every unanswered question is someone still waiting. That understanding kept Emily's case alive. The community also changed after the investigation ended. People who once avoided discussing the disappearance began sharing their memories. Stories that had remained private for years were finally spoken aloud. Friends remembered Emily's personality. Neighbors remembered her presence. People who never met her learned about the life she had before she became part of a criminal investigation. And that may have been the greatest victory. Because the investigation did not only reveal what happened to Emily. It brought Emily herself back into the conversation. Her life. Her dreams. Her impact on the people around her. For her family, that mattered more than anything. They had spent years hearing Emily's name connected to tragedy. Now they wanted her name connected to something more. Love. Memory. Legacy. They wanted people to understand that Emily was not defined by the crime committed against her. She was defined by the life she lived. The people she touched. The moments she created. The person she was before everything changed. That became the final message of the case. Remember the victim before the mystery. Remember the person before the headline. Remember the life before the loss. Because every cold case begins with a human story. The investigation may focus on evidence. The courtroom may focus on facts. The media may focus on the shocking details. But families remember something different. They remember a voice. A smile. A habit. A favorite memory. They remember the person. And that is why cold cases matter. Because solving a case is not only about finding a suspect. It is about restoring a piece of someone's story. It is about telling the world that a life mattered. Years after Emily's case was solved, her story continued to inspire conversations about missing persons and unsolved crimes. People asked questions they had never asked before. They looked at old cases differently. They understood that silence does not always mean the end. Sometimes, silence is only the space before the truth appears. The Emily Carter investigation became proof that answers can come from unexpected places. A forgotten record. A preserved piece of evidence. A memory someone finally decides to share. A question someone finally decides to ask. The case began with a disappearance that seemed impossible to explain. It continued through decades of uncertainty. It survived through the determination of people who refused to forget. And it ended with the one thing Emily's family had wanted from the beginning. The truth. Not a perfect ending. Not a happy ending. But an honest one. A final answer after years of waiting. A final chapter after decades of searching. The cold case was solved. Justice was served. And Emily Carter was finally remembered not as a mystery that lasted 30 years, but as a life that mattered forever.